Hey everyone, welcome back to another Lightroom training session with Joburg Photowalkers. Glad you could join. Today we're going to do it a little bit differently. So in previous sessions, just to recap, we started with the panels in Lightroom in pretty much the order you would use to edit an image. So starting off with the basic or the light panel where you're adjusting for exposure, contrast, all the different tonal adjustments to get your exposure correct in different areas of your image. Then, before that we actually did workflow, so how to organize your images, how to store your images, those sort of things. Then we went into actually editing an image and we did the light panel. The next panel we did was the color panel, where we looked at how to adjust colors, how to fix white balance, these sort of things. Today we're getting to the next two panels. We're going to be doing two panels together because they are sort of related. They kind of overlap. So we're going to look at the details panel and the effects panel. We're starting with the effects panel. And different to previous sessions where we looked at the theory a bit more and then started the edits, today we're going to hop straight into editing. Again, just like previous sessions, you're welcome to put any comments into the chat, into the YouTube chat. I will keep an eye on it and answer any questions as we go along. So you're welcome to, firstly say hi in the chat. I'm happy everybody's joining. I see more and more people joining right now. So we'll have a look at the effects panel and the details panel today. So these are after you've adjusted your exposure and your tonal ranges of your image, gotten that correct, and also your colors, corrected for any issues with your color, and maybe enhanced some color where you needed it to. Now we're getting into some of the finer details of just polishing an edit, and that's where the effects and details panels will come in. We'll look at some example images, and also I've got two images from Mark Straw from Joburg Photowalkers, from a bus ride, a historic bus ride they did. So I think that's going to be good. I think some of you already saw some of his images. We'll do two example edits on images that he did or he took. Just to get some variety in the images, and also to see what the effects and details panels will do to some other images. Okay, let me hop into my Lightroom and we'll get started. Good stuff, good stuff. Let me quickly see if there's any comments so far. If there's any questions, just let me have a quick look. Good, we're ready to go. So we've got a couple of example images. Just full disclosure, I'm not a wildlife photographer. It's not something I really do. I mostly do people portraits or street portraits or street photography, but generally the sort of images I take will have people in them, and something like wildlife is quite out of the norm for me. But in this case, some of the effects and details that we're going to be adjusting is you can really see the effect it has on things like wildlife. And if you can see the effect there nicely, then you will know how to apply it to other edits, maybe cityscapes, portraits, all these other things. The main thing, again, just like with our other tools we've got in Lightroom, is to understand the tools, only use them when they are actually getting you towards the goal, the mood, the image that you've got in your mind that you actually want to put out. So whether it's fixing things or building in a style or a mood, that's the sort of things we do in Lightroom. And again, we need to understand all the tools we've got in our toolbox to be able to get to those images that we actually envision before we start editing. Okay. I see people saying running on battery. Yeah, load shedding. Good luck. We're all getting our share, I think. But luckily, touch wood, for now I'm still okay. And we can carry on with the stream. Just on that, If something happens and my lights go off or something, I'll just switch over to backup power and we'll keep going. So if something goes dark, just give me a minute to switch over. But for now, we should be good. Good stuff. You should be seeing my Lightroom there. Like we said, let me just open the first image. So yeah, full disclosure, I'm not a wildlife photographer, but we'll see the effects of what we're going to be doing. I'm going to quickly run through the top part of this because we've already covered all these tools in previous sessions. You can go back and have a look at those. But the first couple of panels, we're just going to adjust to get somewhere in the ballpark and then polish off our image when we get to our effects and details panels, which are the two we're going to be spending time in today. We're just doing 4 example images, shouldn't take too long. And right from the start, I'm going to change my profile. So what I want to do is just go to something like Adobe Landscape, I think, or even Vivid might be nice. Vivid, the colors are quite nice. So this shot was done quite late in the evening, well, late afternoon, so almost sunset. And I think Vivid will suit it. So this is just a color profile, similar to the color profiles you've got in your camera, where you can set it to monochrome, or you can set it to portrait, or you can set it to vivid or landscape or natural or muted, or whatever profiles your camera has got built in. When I imported it, it matched the camera profile I set when I actually took the photo. Now I just want to go to Adobe Vivid to get a bit of a nice color there. It's looking good so far. Now in the light panel, we're going to adjust any issues that we've got with light. This was a little bit backlit, so I underexposed a tiny bit on the subject that we've got here. And just before we hop into the light panel, what I like to do before adjusting the light is just to crop, because the crop will actually influence your histogram. Your histogram up at the top when you're looking at your exposure will show the whole image, obviously. And if you crop, it might change your histogram because you might be cropping off maybe a bright part or something like that. So let me do a crop. I'm going to just maybe tighten it up. Oh, this little lock locks it to a specific ratio of width to height. I've put it back to the ratio that my camera shoots in. It's 4:3, which is the micro four thirds sensor. And I'm just going to bring it in a little bit tighter than it was, but I still want a center composition on this. This was the idea of my shot. I don't want it off to a side. I want it to be the main focus of my image. So now that I've cropped, I can happily adjust my light settings because my histogram will now reflect what's in my crop. Exposure looks okay-ish. I can see a bit of a gap on the bright side, so we'll need to move it a tiny bit this way, I think, just to get a bit of a wider dynamic range. On the blacks, it's looking quite close. I'm going to start with my whites and just push them up a little bit to the right. That's already looking good. I'm going to drop my highlights a tiny bit just to get my sky a little bit darker. And this is, again, this is to taste and to the mood that you want to edit to. I'm just doing what I think will suit this image. I'm lightening my shadows. As you can see, my subject there is quite dark, sort of in the shadows. So if I push my shadows to the right, I'm going to get better exposure there. So now we can see some details come in right here on the textures, which is exactly what we want. So maybe a tiny bit more even. That's looking good. I'm going to put a little bit more contrast into this image, not much, just a tad. Starting to look good to my eye. I can go whites a tiny bit more if I really want to, but then the sky goes a bit white. Blacks maybe a tiny bit down just to increase my contrast in my image. Not too far. So as I push my whites to the right and my blacks to the left, that'll have the same effect as increasing contrast. And maybe even open up my shadows a tiny bit more. So just zooming in a tiny bit, that's looking good already. Lightroom, if you're using the cloud version, will very often edit on what Lightroom calls a smart preview. So a smart preview, basically, what the smart preview does is it's not the full resolution image, so it speeds up your editing in Lightroom, but something like zooming in onto an image, you're not getting the full resolution in the zoom. So even if things are looking a little bit pixelated when you zoom in, it's very often just because you're editing on the smart preview. When you export your image, you're going to be getting the full resolution image. It's just to speed up the editing that Lightroom does this. Okay. I think that covers the light panel for now. We're just going to leave that there. Normally I would spend a bit more time there, but I'm happy for this. My white balance is as shot, and like I said, it was late afternoon. It was like almost sunset. It was a bit of a warmer scene, but my white balance was as shot and my camera was set on auto white balance. So what I'm expecting is that my camera saw all this orangey warm glow, and it actually made the color temperature more towards blue to compensate for that, to get a normal, what the camera thought was a normal white balance. So to get it back to closer to what I actually saw with my eye, I might just increase the color temperature a tiny bit, because it was a sort of a warmer sunset scene. I think that already gets closer. So I just pushed my temperature a little bit towards the right, to the warmer side. If I really wanted to, I can do some color grading in the shadows. Because I want this warm glow from the image, I could go for my shadows a little bit blue, which the effect this will do, or will give me, is because I'm cooling down my shadows, I'm getting a bit of let's call it color contrast. So if my midtones and my highlights are warmer and my shadows are cooler, there's a bit of color contrast there that sometimes gives a nice effect, if that's what you're going for. In this case, I'm going to do exactly that. My midtones, I might just warm up a tiny bit towards the oranges or reds there, just to get a bit more orange in my midtones here. And my highlights, I will most likely also warm up a tiny bit, so my sky is a little bit less blue, a little bit more sunsetty, warmer color there. And I think that's enough for the light and the color panels. So now we're getting to effects. This is where we want to spend our time today. And the very first slider right there says texture, and it does very much what the name says. This is again one of the newer features of Lightroom, and not so long ago this slider wasn't in Lightroom, and you basically had to go with your overall contrast in your image, where you could adjust your contrast together with something like sharpening or clarity to get detail to come out in your images. So increasing contrast overall in your image generally will make detail pop out more, because for instance, something like the texture right here, this texture, if I increase contrast, the darker areas will go darker, the lighter areas will go lighter, and that effect will give me more texture. So previously we had to play between those sliders to actually increase something like texture in grass, or skin textures, or in this case the textures here on the side. So basically what this will do, now that they've given us a texture slider, is it isolates our contrast or our texture in very small fine details. So something like skin, something like grass, something like rough walls, anything with fine textures, this will isolate the contrast right there. And the one nice thing with this texture slider is it won't change any tones of the colors in those areas. So increasing or decreasing this will preserve the color, but it will give you either a smoother effect or a more textured effect going left or right. So that the slider going left, let's just zoom in a tiny bit here on this image. Hopefully you can see some texture now. So moving my texture slider to the left will decrease texture. So as you can see, things become very smoothed out. You can see it here in the grass as well. You can see it right here as well. So basically what's happening is we're smoothing out textures. When will we use this? Sometimes it's handy editing skin, just to get a bit of a smoother skin texture, and going the other way will enhance texture. So anything that has a nice texture, especially if you're doing things like wildlife, if you're doing birds, feathers, anything like that, this texture slider will give you more texture in micro details. So something like feathers on a bird, it will really start coming out and popping if you start moving this to the right. Now you can see I'm doing plus 100%, so this is completely overdone in texture, but you can see the effect. Hopefully in the video as well you'll be able to see the effect nicely as I move this texture slider to the right. So you'll see in the grass, and you'll see also right here the fine textures, the fine little hairs are all starting to separate and pop out. And it's just basically increasing contrast in very fine details or textures. So that's a very handy slider. I'm going to move it a tiny bit to the right just to increase texture in the shot, because I think it enhances what we're seeing. Maybe not that much, but might just overdo it a tiny bit just for you to be able to see it easier in the video. Clarity is similar, but it will also influence larger details. So texture is the very, very fine detail, whereas clarity will influence larger objects, larger detail as well. And the clarity slider might also, because it adjusts contrast, it might also change colors a tiny little bit. Just have a look at what the clarity does. If I drop clarity, you'll see the contrast decrease, and you'll basically in effect lose detail. If I move it the other way, you'll see detail come into the image, especially also in areas with bigger details and not just the small textures that you'll find in the image. So clarity will basically increase contrast, but not in the overall image. It will try to isolate objects and finer detail. So clarity would be somewhere between your normal contrast slider and your texture slider. Texture would be the smallest of details, so micro contrast. Clarity would be in between, and then your contrast slider would be the overall image. So clarity, we can put a little bit of clarity in, but this is something that that can be easily overdone, and it will look over sharpened and unrealistic. Dehaze is an interesting one. So dehaze, on hazy days, basically what happens is there's some haze in the air and it decreases your contrast in your image. So if we do dehaze and we move it to the right, what basically will happen is we'll start introducing contrast, and it will try to compensate for any haziness in your image. So if you're doing cityscapes or landscapes and it was a little bit hazy, moving this slider to the right will increase contrast in a way that compensates for that haze, and it will try. It's not always perfect, but it will try to take some of that haziness out of your image. Okay, let's go back. If we move the dehaze slider to the left, it will actually introduce some haze into your image. So you will see, moving the slider to the left, it will go all white and hazy, and I will lose contrast. So sometimes you want to actually, for mood, maybe it's a shot in a forest or something, and you want to enhance the mood, you might want to move your haze slider to the left to introduce a little bit of haze into that shot to enhance that mood. Just remember that as you introduce haze into the shot, you're losing contrast, and you're basically washing out your image as if you're shooting through fog or haze. Okay. The next slider we've got, let's just stop for 1 second there. Are there any questions on any of these sliders so far? I'm just going to pause there, give you a chance to give me any questions in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing that, finding it interesting to see the differences. Yep, it is definitely interesting. So before we carry on with the next slider, which is Vignette, which is quite a different thing to the ones we've already done, it makes sense to just think about a couple of things when you're approaching your contrast, your texture, your clarity, and also a little bit of DAs, something to keep in mind. Let me just switch cameras here. So basically what happens when you are sharpening an image or adding texture or clarity or contrast is you're separating lighter areas from darker areas. So it basically looks for where your image goes from a darker area to a lighter area, and it tries to move those two apart by adjusting how light or dark an area is. Okay. So thinking about it this way, your camera has got pixels, it's little blocks on the sensor. And if you, let's say I take a white paper and a black paper and I put them overlapping and I take a photo of that transition between black and white. If I zoom into my image, there's going to be pixels in the middle that will be gray. Why does this happen? Well, the completely white pixels that's on the white paper, if I zoom in there, that pixel only saw the white paper, so that pixel turns white. On the black side, on the dark side, if a pixel only saw the black paper, it turns black. In the overlap, where the two papers overlap on that little edge, there's going to be pixels there that actually sees a little bit of the black paper and a little bit of the white paper. What does it do then? That pixel can only choose its color. It can't go, oh, I'm halfway black or halfway white. It chooses a luminance value based on the light that hits it. So basically it goes gray. It's somewhere in between. If it saw more of the black, it's going to be a darker gray. If it saw more of the white, it's going to be a lighter gray, more towards the white side. Now, what Lightroom allows us to do with adjusting texture, clarity, and also we'll get to sharpening. When we're doing all these things, Lightroom is basically looking for these pixels, these areas that's all the transitions. And it will basically take that gray pixel and move it to the closest one next to it. So if there's an area of black, an area of gray, and it sees, no, let's do it this way. If there's an area of black and an area of white, and it sees pixels in the middle that are gray, it will move that gray either to the black or to the white to get to a crisper edge right there on the edge of the subject or whatever it is, on that transition of that object. So that's the way to think about sharpening, is it's basically just making that transition sharper from one color to the next, or from one luminance value, one brightness to the next. That's what we're doing with sharpening, with adding texture, with adding clarity. It just does it in different areas of your image. So the overall one is your contrast slider. The very micro textures with small transitions, that's your texture one. So those are the micro textures on something. Clarity is sort of in between, and sharpening will just try to look at edges of things where there's an object going to a next object. It's trying to identify those edges for you. Now, none of these sliders are foolproof. You have to play around with them. Differs from image to image, and you have to just find a good spot for those. Okay, let's hop back into Lightroom here. I'm just giving a chance for questions. Doesn't look like there's any questions for now. Again, if you've got any questions, just pop them in the chat. Happy to answer those. Good. So the next slider we've got is Vignette. And let me just close my grain slider as well. What you will notice here, if you look at my cursor on the screen, hopefully you've got your YouTube set in a good resolution so you can see the detail. You'll see that some sliders in Lightroom, there's actually detail underneath them that you can pop out or expose. So I can, like for instance, my vignette slider here, I've got a vignette. If you know what a vignette is, it just either darkens or lightens the outer part of your image. A lot of lenses will have a natural vignette just because of the optics, the way it's built. It will sort of darken the corners for you. A lot of vintage lenses will have a vignette. a darkening of the corners. And sometimes it's a nice effect where it moves your focus in an image to the center. So you'll see I've got a vignette slider. If I move it to the left, my corners go completely black all the way over. And again, this is a slider where you want to use it sparingly. So if I go just a tiny bit, it will just darken the corners of my image a tiny bit, and it will make my eye and my focus go to the center of this image. Okay. Moving the vignette to the opposite side will do the opposite. It will give me lighter or whiter corners, and again, I can do just a tiny bit of this if I wanted to. Maybe less handy in most conditions. So generally you wouldn't want to put a white vignette on anything. You would go darker so that your eye goes to the middle of the image. But there are some exceptions. If you're doing high key images, or maybe you're doing product images on a white background, you might want to move the slider to the white side to lighten the corners, so that the darkest area is the actual product on the white background. Or if it's a high key portrait, then the darkest area is your subject, for instance, and it's got the same effect. Your eye will go to the highest contrast area, so where there's light and dark next to each other, which in that case will again be the middle. Yeah, so that's vignette. And we've got just this one slider, but what Lightroom gives us is this little triangle in the corner. If you see where my mouse pointer is right now, and this little triangle, if I click it, will open up a little drop-down menu for vignette, and that gives me more settings that I can then adjust. Similar to, you'll see the grain slider just below it, and it's also got a little extra settings you can pop out. So in a lot of cases, you might not need these. It's optional. You can just adjust the main slider, or have it closed and adjust the main slider. But it's good to understand what these other sliders do. Let me give you an example. So I'm going to put a very pronounced dark vignette on this. This is obviously not something we would do on this image, but to show you the effect of the other sliders, I'm going to do that. Midpoint slider. So this moves my midpoint in and out. So closer to the center, closer to the outside. So the amount of vignette is still the same, but I'm moving my midpoint of my vignette around. So maybe I want it closer to my subject in this case. And sometimes it's nice to adjust your vignette to be a lot more than what you would need. But then you can adjust these sliders at the bottom. You can see the effect very well. And then go back and put your vignette back to a more reasonable place where it actually looks good. But if you start there, it's hard to see the effects of the sliders below it. So I'm going to overdo it again, and we can look at these other sliders. So midpoint is moving it in and out. Roundness. So if your aspect ratio of your photo is like a landscape image or a portrait image and it's not square, this roundness slider will make your vignette either closer to fitting the aspect ratio of your image, or it will make it more round, like a circle. So you can have a circular vignette, or you can have one that's more shaped like the aspect ratio of your image, so more oval in this case. The next one is feather. That gives you control over the darkest point to the lightest point and how fast that happens. So how quickly does it go from dark to light? So if I go left in my feather, there's going to be no feather, which means I'm going from dark to light in basically a couple of pixels. If I move this feather to the right, it will fade it in more, and I will have more of a fade from my darkest to my lightest image in a longer part of my image. So I'm going to leave this in the middle for now. Highlights. In this image, you probably won't see the effect of highlights. The only thing this does is it preserves highlights if you move it to the right. So if I move it to the right and there's any bright areas, you'll see it a little bit in my sky. So it leaves my sky a little bit more closer to the original if I move it to the right, and it darkens everything about the same if I move it left. So basically what happens now, and let's say you've got a night shot of a city and there's lots of pinpoints of lights in buildings, street lights, car lights, these sort of things. what basically happens is if you've got any of those brighter spots in the outer parts of your image in the corners, and you move this highlight slider to the right, it will preserve those bright spots. So it will darken those corners, but it will try and preserve those spots of brighter areas when you move this to the right. Okay. If you've got anything like candle lights or lights in a shot and they're closer to the edges, this will control how much they darken with the rest of the image. Okay. I'm going to move my vignette back, and I have just the tiniest, slightest vignette just to get our eyes to focus on the center. The next one we're going to be looking at is grain. And if I zoom in on my sky, that's usually a good place to see your grain. Right now, this is a digital image, so my sky is pretty much one color in this area. It's sort of, in digital images especially, it's very uniform in areas like sky areas, or in areas where there's a uniform color. Let's say the side of a car or something where things are uniform, you'll get this very uniform look to it. In film images, if you're looking at old 35mm film images, for instance, you'll see grain. The film had grain in it, and that grain that's built into the film, you could generally see. And the nice thing with grain, similar to when you're printing on matte art paper, or if you're printing on a canvas, it can actually enhance your image. And if you want to be adding grain, this is your slider. And again, you might not see the details below it, so you can click on the little triangle and it will give you a bit more control on this grain. But the top slider is my grain, and I can add grain by going towards the right. So I'm going to completely overdo my grain so you can actually see what it does. So you'll see a mottled, grainy effect appear in this, especially in the sky area, but it actually applies it everywhere in your image. But in places like this, where there's a lot of texture, you might not see the effect because it's putting the grain on a very textured area, and it sort of disappears into the texture. In smooth areas of your image, you'll see the grain a lot more. So it applies this grain. So again, places like the sky, it would be very visible. Also, if you're doing something like portraits and you decrease texture to get a smoother skin texture, you might want to introduce a bit of grain just to get it looking natural again. So decreasing texture a little bit in a portrait image will give you a more uniform skin, but it might start to look a little bit plasticky, and then introducing a tiny bit of grain will give you a bit of skin texture back, which is sometimes a good idea. It's just a nice way of editing skin. It's a bit of a shortcut, not going to Photoshop and doing real intensive skin retouching, but Lightroom does a pretty good job of portraits. So the next little slider here is called size. So this gives us the size of the grain. So we can have bigger grain. In the old days, higher ISO films would have a bigger, more grainy appearance, and lower ISO films would have less grain and smaller, finer grain. So this is where we can adjust the size. I can go left, and the size of this grain becomes a lot smaller, so it's tiny little dots. If I go to the right, you'll see the grain gets very pronounced and the size of the grain gets bigger. So the amount of grain is the first one, the size of the grain is the second one. Okay, and then the last one is the roughness. So the roughness of the grain means how uniform this grain is. If I go left, the grain would be very uniform straight through. If I move it to the right, the grain will be very varied. So the texture of the grain will be much more varied, and I have a much more interesting and more varied pattern. Generally, if you use both of these sliders in the default position, which is 25 and 50, it's a pretty good start, and you just go up and down in how much grain you want. So I'm just going to put a tiny bit of grain into this image because generally I like a bit of grain. For black and white images, I might introduce more grain because I think it enhances the feel of a black and white image. For color image, I generally would introduce a little bit less grain. But a little tip, if you're printing a lot and if you're printing large, introducing a tiny bit of grain will actually make the prints look better, especially if you're printing on glossy paper. It might just, when you've got transitions in the sky, for instance, if you've got a sunset and it transitions from one color to a different color, the grain breaks it up a little bit so you don't see those lines where the colors change. So it's a nice way of just breaking up solid blocks of color a tiny bit, and it just, especially if you're viewing this at a normal distance, it will look nice. If you're straight up against something looking with a magnifying glass, you might not like the grain, but in general, if you're looking at a normal distance at an image, it could enhance your image a tiny bit. So this is grain, generally very similar to film grain. You can add it or not. Okay, then the next sliders we're getting to is under our detail panel, and this is where we do our sharpening and noise reduction. So these two things are sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. Sharpening will try to enhance detail and give you sharper edges on stuff, on the outside edges of objects. And noise reduction will try and take noise out of your image, but what it will very often do is make your image a little bit less sharp if you do a lot of noise reduction. Okay, so let's start with sharpening. You've got a little slider here, and Adobe on this one slider, they've thought it a good idea to make the right hand side red, and it goes gray as you go to the left. And there's a reason why this part is red. Adobe is basically telling us, don't go there. Over sharpening. Oh, I've got a question. What's the difference between grain and noise? Okay, so I'm just going to focus on digital photography because I think most of us, especially in Joburg Photowalkers, we mostly shoot digital, although film photography is quite nice to do. If you're just looking at digital photography, your noise will be pixels on your sensor that are either a different brightness than they should be, or they are a different color than they should be. And this just happens because sensors are sensors, and some of these tiny little pixels just get things wrong. There are different reasons for noise to be introduced. One of the reasons would be noise can be introduced at high ISO levels. So you're making these little pixels, these little sensors, so sensitive to light, and there actually isn't that much light in the environment, that some of them they get their value wrong. It's just the way digital sensors function. It's the way they work. And basically what happens is you might be taking an image of a gray wall and there's one white pixel in between or a black pixel in between that shouldn't be that color. Or even you're taking an image of a gray wall and there's a blue or a purple or a red pixel in there that it got it wrong. It's just due to the process and the way cameras work, this happens. Especially in low light, especially at high ISO, this effect increases. You get more of this issue. So if you've shot high ISOs at low light, you can zoom into a piece of the image like the sky or a part that should be one color, and you'll see little dots there. They're just the wrong color. So that's noise. And for our purposes here, that's basically it's digital noise. So it's just introduced by the fact of the digital sensor and the way things work with your camera, without getting into any of the technical details. It's basically digital. And then comparing that to grain is actually, in the case of Lightroom, it actually tries to simulate film grain. So it's more of a texture. You can see it as sort of a texture on paper. So if you're printing on normal paper or a matte art paper, the paper has got grain in it. It's got a texture that's part of the paper. And if you print onto this, you can actually see that texture. You can compare a glossy magazine with a matte magazine, and the textures are different. Glossy magazine will have almost no texture, where a matte magazine will have the paper texture there. And in a lot of cases, that texture is actually enhancing the image, and it's nice to have. So editing an image where we decrease noise, which is digital noise, which is actually detracting from the image, but adding grain is actually a nice way to edit in a lot of circumstances. So that's basically the difference. Your noise is digital and it's artifacts, and it shouldn't be there, and it might detract from your image, whereas your grain is something that's actually, depending on the image, it might enhance your image, and it looks less digital, it looks more natural. Okay, I hope that answers that question. If there's any more questions, just pop it in the chat. Let's keep editing here. We want to quickly get through these. Sharpening, like I said, this part is red. We don't want to go there. Over sharpening is something that I quite often see in images, especially on social media. People just push the sharpening way up, similar to what they might do with saturation. Looks unnatural, might not be a good thing. And there's a reason why Adobe makes this right-hand part like from red to the oranges and then goes gray. So generally we should try and stay within that gray area. I'm going to do some sharpening, and I'm going to go close to the red so you can see the effect better on the image. We are zoomed in, so you should see the effect quite well. Again, sharpening by default is closed on the little drop down, so you can just increase your sharpening and let Lightroom do what it does. But in general, I want better control of what it sharpens, because just sharpening the whole image is generally not a good idea. For instance, let's take a portrait. If you just sharpen the whole image, you might get the eyes looking great and sharp, but you're also sharpening the skin, which will then enhance any blemishes on the skin, which detracts from the portrait. So if you think about it, you might actually want to soften the skin and sharpen eyes, for instance, to get a better portrait. And the same thing holds for whatever you're doing. If you're doing a landscape or a cityscape, your clouds, for instance, you want soft. You don't want to sharpen clouds at all, ever, because they look very unnatural and bad when you sharpen clouds. But your city skyline, you want to sharpen so that you can get all that detail in the skyline itself, where the buildings meet the sky. Those edges should be sharpened. So having control over the sharpening is actually quite nice. So we do selective sharpening. Okay. The first little slider here, it says radius. The only thing that radius does is it tells the sharpening on how small of an object it should actually apply the sharpening. If I move the radius to the left, it will look for smaller radiuses to sharpen, so it will sharpen more of the image. If I move a radius to the right, it will look for bigger radiuses, bigger edges, and it will only sharpen bigger, like less detailed images. So if you think about this, if somebody's got spiky hair, where their hair is sticking up into the sky on your image, that's where you'll find tiny little radiuses and lots of detail. If you want to sharpen the hair, you need to drop this radius slider to the left to get smaller radiuses so that it sharpens those each individual little hairs sticking up. If you're doing a cityscape, for instance, and with big buildings, then you might move your radius to the right so that it doesn't sharpen the smallest detail, but only sharpens those bigger edges where buildings meet sky, for instance. Okay, generally I like to leave it sort of where it is by default, which is at 1. Detail slider, very similar. If you move it left, your threshold for detail is lower, so it will basically sharpen more of the image. And if you move it to the right, it won't sharpen as much detail. Is it that way around? Yeah. So this is basically where the slider, where you tell it to sharpen only the whole image, or only the areas with bigger detail. So you're basically telling it to ignore finer detail or finer textures. Don't include that in the sharpening. So we'll put that back to 25, which is also the default, which is where I generally like it. The last one is the slider that I pretty much every time when I'm using sharpening, I'm using this. So masking tells the sharpening where to be applied. So sharpening right now, if masking is on 0, it means there's no masking. So right now it's sharpening the whole image based on the radius and the detail that I've set, but it's sharpening everywhere. You can see that if I hold in my Alt key on my keyboard and I start moving this slider around. So I'm moving it to the left. You'll see everything is white, which means everything is being sharpened in this whole image. Which also means I'm sharpening skin if it was a portrait, which also means I'm sharpening clouds if it was a landscape with clouds in it. And that's exactly what I don't want to do. As I move the slider to the right, you will see some of the areas turn black. So the black areas are not being sharpened. And you'll see as I slowly go to the right, more areas are turning black. And it's only sharpening the bigger edges of my image. So you'll see if I go all the way to the right, I'm not sharpening the sky, I'm mostly not sharpening the grass, I'm mostly sharpening the edges of this subject. So I'm getting the horns there, I'm getting the outlines very much sharpened in bright white there. If you're doing portraits, if you're doing landscapes with clouds, you generally want to move this masking slider towards the right to exclude clouds, to exclude skin. You don't want to be sharpening skin ever at all. And you'll see as you move this, the eyes will stay, the mouth will stay, the edges of hair will generally stay, but something like skin will be one of the first things that will go towards black, which means no sharpening. Okay. So in this case, now I'm sharpening the outline of the horns. Some of the texture on it will be sharpened, but I'm not sharpening my sky, I'm not sharpening the grass at the back. So this is a nice thing to do. Any questions on sharpening? Mainly you just need to remember, don't go to the reds and use the mask to exclude anything that you don't want to sharpen. So things that should be soft, things that should be fluffy, soft, things like skin and clouds, you want to exclude by moving this masking slider, and holding Alt and then moving it gives you that little black and white image to show you where the masking is applied. It's very handy. If you're editing on your iPhone, or if you're editing on an Android phone, or if you're editing on a tablet of any variation like an iPad, you basically hold a finger on your image and then slide the slider. Oh, actually, you start sliding the slider and then hold a finger on the image, and it will give you that exact black and white image showing you where the sharpening is applied. Okay, so Alt, yes. On both Mac and PC, the key you hold is Alt. So on Mac, they call it the Option key. On PC or Windows, it's the Alt key, ALT, Alt. So you hold that and then slide the slider. On mobile devices, any mobile devices with a touch screen, you start sliding the slider around and then you put a finger on the image and it does the exact same thing. Mac, yes, on Mac it's your Alt or Option key. It's the little thing that starts with one line and then it splits into two lines. So it's Option or Alt next to your Command key. Good. Everybody happy so far? Give me more questions. I'm happy to answer more. Otherwise, we'll just quickly look at noise reduction. Again, similar to previous panels, when you install Lightroom, they generally collapse like this, so you can only see noise reduction and color noise reduction. Is it 80% safe to never have extra halo, especially for nature? Sonia, good question. Halos. Halos is something that I often see in nature. I often see it, or nature photography, I often see it in cityscapes as well, on the skyline where the buildings go into the sky, where you can see that transition from sky to building. I very often see halos. A halo is an area surrounding the building or surrounding the subject, especially when there's a lighter background and then the subject on top of that. Around that, you very often see halos when people edit, and it's because of editing. So over sharpening, especially if you go to that red area in your sharpening, over sharpening, using things like clarity too much. If you overdo any of these enhancements to the edges, you'll see those white areas and it will look like a halo right surrounding your subject or your skyline. So if you can imagine a building with the blue sky behind it, it should all be blue until you hit the building. But if there's a little white line or a lighter color line around your building, that glowy halo surrounding it, then you've done something wrong. You've either over sharpened, put too much clarity in, you've done something that's trying to enhance the image actually too much. So you should back down on your sharpening, you should back down on whatever you did to create that halo. A little trick here is, for instance, on PC or Mac, there's a little eye at the top. So you'll see my detail panel. And if I click this eye at the top and I hold it in, it will take everything in that detail panel and not apply it. So for instance, if I got a halo and I'm not sure, is it something I did in my effects panel, or is it something I did in my detail panel? I can then hold this little eye and see, oh, is the halo still there or not if I take the effect away. If it's still there, then I can maybe go to my detail panel. I can do the same and see, is the halo still there or not? And then at least I know it's somewhere in there and I can go and find what I did to introduce that halo. Because generally halos is a really bad thing. They detract from images, they look very artificial, and we don't want halos. We want those edges nice and crisp without creating any halos on the backgrounds. Okay. Yeah, you are exactly correct. So Sonia was talking about judges, so I guess camera club and over sharpening or introducing too much clarity or similar will give you halos, and you don't want that. Definitely something you want to look at. Anytime you apply either sharpening or some of the effects in the effects panel, anytime you're increasing any of these or you're increasing your sharpening, you want to zoom in and have a look at your edges, especially where lighter areas and darker areas are overlapping. So generally you'd be able to spot it very easily when something goes over to sky from a darker sort of object. Okay. Detail panel. This is the last panel we're doing. Like I said, when you install Lightroom, these will be all collapsed. The sharpening we just did. Noise reduction, we can also open that up to see more detail sliders. And color noise reduction, we can also open up to get more control on that. Generally, what I found in the sort of images that I've done, let me just quickly check. I see somebody said they've lost connection. Let's give them a second just to see if they can catch back up. Just want to see if my connection is still good. It looks healthy. You know, I hope you can reconnect. My connection still looks sort of healthy. If anybody else has got, everybody else still happy? Just check. I'm just checking that everybody else is still on the stream. Again, thank you. Okay, so we'll just carry on. If everybody else is still fine, I was just worried about the connection there. You know, we will have a replay as usual on the channel, so you'll be able to watch it afterwards if you are unable to reconnect. Great. Let's carry on with noise reduction and color noise reduction. So basically we get two types of noise. The one is the luminosity value, or the bright and darkness is wrong. So you get an area that should be one brightness and there's a pixel or two or three that are either brighter or darker, and your noise reduction will then take those out and make it the same as the surrounding pixel. So it's looking at surrounding pixels and figuring out this one pixel is wrong, and it just flips it to something that makes sense. Your color noise reduction, similar thing, but basically what it is your color value of that one pixel is going to be wrong. So everything is, for instance, white, and there's one blue pixel or a red pixel or a purple pixel right there, and it shouldn't be. It's just the digital sensor that introduced that noise for whatever reason, maybe high ISO. Then that's the way to fix it, is with color noise reduction. So they work very similarly, and basically if we want to decrease noise, we move the slider to the right and it will start taking noise out of your image. And similar to the color noise, we move it to the right and it will take more noise out. What it will do is it will give you a bit more of a plasticky, artificial feel if you go too far with noise reduction. So in normal images, we want to do as little as possible noise reduction, but if you did shoot high ISO at night, for instance, you might want to do a little bit more noise reduction. If the image looks a little bit noisy, then you can put a tiny bit of noise reduction in, and maybe a tiny bit of color noise reduction, and there we go. Detail just tells it what sort of smaller details to ignore, so it's a threshold for detail. If we move it left, the threshold is nothing, which means it will look for noise everywhere, and it will try and smoothen things out for you. If you move it to the right, it will look for larger areas with one piece of noise in it, and then only fix those. So it will start to ignore finer textures and details like skin and grass and these things. So generally right in the middle is a good place, but if you find that you're losing skin texture, for instance, you want to move it to the right to increase the threshold of what it actually sees as noise. If you see that it's not picking up all the noise in an image that it should be picking up, you might move it to the left. Contrast. This just preserves contrast, and it tells it how much contrast to preserve. So if you move it to the right, it will preserve more contrast, and to the left less. So it will do more smoothing in your noise reduction. If you go left, it will preserve more to the right. Color noise, very similar. More noise reduction to the right, less noise reduction to the left. Detail, if we go less detail, your threshold of what it's seeing as noise is less, so it will do more noise reduction in maybe areas that you don't want it to do noise reduction, like on skin or something. And if you put it more to the right, it raises the threshold and it will look for noise or color noise in less places and only in more uniform places. And smoothness just smooths out your color noise reduction. So if you move it to the right, you'll get smoother areas of one color. If you move it to the left, it will have more like detail in the color areas. So you can decide how smooth you want your colors to look by moving this left and right. Perfect. That gets us to the end of the two panels that we're doing, and we're going to have a look at two images that Mark sent through, and this is the first one. So we're going to do two quick edits. Let me just give you the background on these two images. So Mark took these. This one is Mary Fitzgerald's Square. The artwork in this image is sort of his focus. It's a very famous artwork. It's by Debongs. I'm sure Mark will be able to share in the WhatsApp group more detail and some articles about this artwork. But it's basically famous artists that was selected by Debongs to be on these murals that he did. And it's looking good. So that's pretty much the focus that Mark went for, and obviously the reflection is quite nice. Mark has got a good eye for catching reflections, and it's a really cool image. And before we finish this one, I'll just show you the last image. This is one where this artist is the focus of the image. This is his artwork, and hold on one second. Okay, that's fine. So basically this is the artist. People were walking past. Mark was taking this image and he said, no, take one with me and my artwork. And he just basically stopped some random people, told them to like hunch down, crouch down, so that he was the focus. And that's the story of the image. So in this one, the idea and the focus will be the artist itself. So that's what we're going to focus on. Just going to have a few quick adjustments and see what we can do in Mark's images, just to get some variety of edits. First thing, I'm going to rotate this image slightly because I can see that my horizon is slightly off. I think that's closer to correct. That's looking good. The light panel, one little tip, what you could do, sometimes it works, sometimes it's not, it's a little bit hit and miss, but we could hit auto and just see what Adobe thinks should happen to this image. So it's just looking through the image and seeing what what Adobe thinks the light and the color panel should be. And you'll see the light panel, the sliders moved, and in the color panel, these sliders moved, vibrance and saturation. So if we want to start off with the auto or the original image, we can decide which one is a better starting point. It does nothing else to the image. It only moves sliders in your light panel, and it will move your vibrance and saturation. Sometimes it overdoes things a little bit, so we can decide if we're going to go with it, but I'm going to use it as a starting point. So what it did is it dropped my highlights, which I quite like. You'll see on the left top corner right here, it's very bright. What the auto did is it dropped the highlights, and I can see some sky detail, I can see some blue coming through, and I might even just help it on a little bit more to get more detail in the clouds and the sky right here. Mark didn't overexpose, so it's looking good. It's lifting the shadows a tiny bit, so we're getting some detail in the darker areas, and I quite like that. So we're getting detail in the bridge as well. You might like it or not, so you can decide if you want to open it up or not. Everything else is looking good there. It boosted vibrance a little bit. So just to recap, vibrance will increase your low saturation colors more as you increase it, where saturation will increase all your colors or decrease all your colors. So why would we rather use vibrance in this case? So in the original, if I put my vibrance back where it was and my saturation back where it was, you'll see that some of these reds are quite vibrant. It's very red. If I increase my saturation, those reds become, to my eye, too red, and some of the other less vibrant colors like the yellows and the blues, especially the blues back here, they don't increase as much as these red, or they're all increasing at the same amount, and these reds are sort of distracting. So a better way of doing it is increasing our vibrance, which will increase these pastel-y blues in the back. Some of these more muted colors will increase more than what this red that is more vibrant will do. So I like increasing vibrance in this case to just get some of the other colors to be as vibrant as the reds in this image. Okay, so that's good for me. We can adjust the individual colors if we really wanted to. I don't think it's at all necessary in this image. We're already close to a nice edit, I think. We'll need to ask Mark afterwards what he thinks about it. But in this case, what I could do is increase texture a tiny bit, because we are focusing on this artwork. Increasing the texture will increase the fine details in this art. So I'm going to increase the texture quite a bit, just to get more details to pop out in this artwork. Clarity, I'm probably going to leave right where it is. I might go a little bit, but I'm very careful of clarity because it can introduce those haloing artifacts and all sorts of over sharpening issues. Clarity will very often look like over sharpening. So I'm not going to do much there. De-haze, I'm just going to leave alone. There's no haze in this image. I'm just leaving it right where it is. Grain, I'm just, maybe not. This image is very clean. It's a very crisp digital image. So I'm not even going to introduce grain into it. I think it's looking quite good. There's no big areas of one color that I want to sort of just introduce a bit of grain into. There's a lot of texture. There's a lot of fine detail. So I'm just going to leave the grain as is. Detail, I'm going to sharpen it. So I'm going to move my sharpening to, let's not overdo it, but let's move it to sort of 70 in this case. I'm going to leave my radius and detail where they are, and I'm just going to move my mask while holding Alt like we learned. Right now we're sharpening everything. Now the black areas aren't sharpened. Now I'm just going to move it to a place where I'm sort of sharpening the artwork, the outlines and the buildings, without sharpening sky or clouds or anything that should be soft, or the underside of the bridge. I don't want to sharpen that texture. Okay, so right there I think is good. This is a daylight image, so I'm not going to do any noise reduction. I'm not going to do any color noise reduction. I don't think there's any of that in the image, and doing too much noise reduction or color noise reduction will actually make me lose some of the detail and the finer textures in this artwork. Okay, so I think that's a good edit on this one. What we could do, and we'll look at selective edits and masking in as one topic in one of the future sessions. But what we could do if we wanted to is we could maybe just put in a linear gradient maybe in the bottom part. So what this allows us to do is to adjust this red part by itself without affecting the rest of it. So I've put a linear gradient in the bottom. Like I said, we'll still look at what that does. I'm just decreasing my exposure by 1/3 of a stop just to get this bottom part a little bit darker so that our eye goes into the top. We've still got all the detail and the colors there, and very often decreasing the exposure will actually make the colors a bit more saturated or look more, it's more deep, rich colors. So like I said, we'll still get to the masking, but in this case, I think it just enhances it a tiny bit. If I really wanted to, I could darken this left-hand side of the image a tiny bit as well, and maybe the right-hand side a tiny bit, just to make your eye go more to the center. But I think overall, this is a good edit as it is. Is everybody still happy? Is the feed coming through good? Just pop it in the feed and we'll do the last edit. Everybody good? Looking good on my side. So this is the last image while we just wait to hear back from you. Everybody's still happy. If there's any questions, pop it in the chat. All good. Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ryan. Okay, then we'll move on to this one. Again, this was the focus. The artist was the focus. Mark will be able to give us some more detail in the WhatsApp group after, I'm sure. But this is his artwork. This is the artist, and this should be the focus of our image. I'm going to crop it before we do anything else. So this bottom part I'm not as interested in, so I'm going to crop it right there. The top part of the image, I think, has got more interest for us in this case. We might straighten it a tiny bit. I think the sidewalk was sloped, so we won't over straighten it. But right there looks good. Again, I'm going to hit auto and just see what auto does. I think the colors are a bit overcooked if I hit auto, so I can already see that the contrast is up, and I'm expecting vibrance and saturation to be up as well. So these colors just to my eye look too much. It's just overdone. It's not very natural. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the extra contrast, which will make the colors pop, but I will just lower my saturation to work against that, to just get the colors back to sort of natural look that looks more natural to my eye. The rest of what the auto did, I'm pretty happy with. It increased the shadows, it decreased highlights, so that will just give us more detail in both highlights and shadows. It will also give you a nice exposure on the skin by doing that. It dropped the exposure a tiny little bit, which I think is fine. So I'm pretty happy with the auto. It's a good starting point in this case. Sometimes auto gets it completely wrong, I have to say, and you have to do your own thing. But in this case, I'm pretty happy. That's looking quite good. I'm going to leave all the color grading because we've got all these colors in the image. If I start messing with colors and color grading and color mixes, I'm going to be changing this guy's artwork, and I think it's a good thing to preserve his original art and the colors there. So I'm going to leave the color as is. Texture, I'll increase texture. No, I won't actually. I'm going to decrease texture a tiny bit. So we've got people in this. They're very far away, so you can't really see the texture on their skin. But still, I want to get the skin texture as good as possible. So maybe that's too much. I'm just going to zoom in. So just lowering the texture a tiny bit just to get skin texture to look good. I feel that it's always nice to get people to look as good as possible. Clarity, I'm going to leave alone. In this case, vignettes. This is an interesting one. We might just vignette it a tiny bit because we said our focus of this image is going to be this artist in the middle. I'm going to vignette the image a tiny bit just to get the corners to go a tiny bit darker, so my eye goes to the center of the image. What's nice and what Mark did here, I'm not sure if this was where the guy posed himself, but a really nice thing about this image is we've got darker artworks around the outer side, and the artwork he's actually in front of is very white, very bright. So the contrast from the artist to the artwork is quite high. So if we sort of squint our eyes and we look at the image, the biggest area of contrast is right here. So we're going from light to a darker contrast with his jacket, with his hair, with his hat. And it actually puts your focus right there where it should be, which is quite nice. Okay, so I think that the vignette even enhances that a little bit more. Then let's go down. We're going to leave all the settings of the vignette alone. I think they're all in good spots. I'm going to do some sharpening, so I don't want to over sharpen. I'm just going to go like halfway in the sharpening, and then again masking, Alt, and I'm going to start moving it right until I see that I'm not sharpening anybody's skin, but I am sharpening things like eyes and the detail, the bigger details of the artwork. And I'm going to leave it there. So now we're not sharpening skin, but we're sharpening the things that we want to sharpen. Okay. Noise reduction, again, this is a daylight image. I'm happy with what Mark did here. I'm sure there's pretty much no digital noise on this, or very little. We can't see it also because we've got no big areas of one color or one tone. I'm very happy with the noise reduction being at the lowest. So now, just to finish this off, if we really wanted to, what we could do to really get the focus on our artist here, and this might be overkill, it might not be needed, but just to show you again a bit of a mask, I'm going to put a radial gradient right here in the middle. I'm going to drag it on top of our artist. And what this does is it lets me adjust just this area, and it fades it out to the side. So at the edge of this radial gradient, there will be no effect on the sliders I change, and closer to the center, I'll get the full effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push my exposure up a tiny bit, and this is now going to only affect that area that I masked. So I'm going to overexpose by 1/3. So this area is now actually too light by 1/3 of a stop. Everything else I think is probably going to be good. I might just lighten my shadows a tiny bit because I know when it comes to people's faces in a case like this, that would be nice to do. And in effect, what we've done now is we've overexposed by 1/3 of a stop. So I'm going to click back to my edit panel, and we know that my focus is overexposed by 1/3 of a stop. What I can just go and do is my overall exposure, I'm going to drop by 1/3 of a stop. Right there. And now the exposure on our artist is going to be correct, and the rest of the image is actually going to be slightly darker, just 1/3 of a stop. We don't want to overdo something like this, but I think what this does now is these other guys that are just adding to this image but aren't the focus are now 1/3 of a stop underexposed, and our artist is perfectly exposed. And I think that just enhances it slightly. You won't really be able to see this when you're looking at this image, but your eye will still go to where I think the best spot is. Okay. This is my edit. I think everybody, when they get an image like this, they might approach it differently. They might do a very different image. They might have a different idea in mind. But talking to Mark, for this image, the idea was this guy is standing, he's the artist, he's the guy who posed the other guy, so he's the important focus of this image. And I'm just trying to slightly enhance that, but still keep the image as original as possible. So that would be my edit on this. Mark, we're happy to hear what you think about my edit. And that brings us to the end of this. If there's any questions, I'll give it a couple of seconds just for you to answer any questions. Otherwise, we will call it a night. Great stuff. It's my pleasure. Glad you enjoyed it, Oscar. I'm going to give it a couple of seconds more. If there's no questions, we'll call it a night. But just a reminder, in the WhatsApp group for the training, you can always, whenever you're editing or you've got a question or if you've got an issue with a photo, I'm happy to answer questions in the WhatsApp through the week. No issues. Glad you found that interesting. Yeah, basically we're just looking at the tools and trying to understand the tools and what they do so that we don't over edit, and also whenever we've got issues with an image or issues getting to the look or the mood that we're trying to get to, that we actually know which tools to opt into to get that look we're going for. Good, everybody happy? Then I'm going to call it tonight. Thank you for joining. The replay will be available. I'll share the link again. Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks Mark for the images and the stories of these. I love it. It's nice editing somebody else's images for a change.